I'd now like to introduce Andrew Cockerall, who's our first speaker tonight. Andrew has worked as a strategic planner at the City of Greater Bendigo since 2002, which included a 6-month stint in Preston, England as part of a job exchange. Prior to this, he worked as a statutory planner at the City of Greater Bendigo, Rural City of Mildura and Shire of Campaspe. In the past 13 years, projects he has been involved with include the Bendigo Residential Development Strategy, Commercial Land Strategy, East Bendigo Local Structure Plan, Jackass Flat Local Structure Plan and Strathfieldsaye Township Plan. More recently, Andrew has had his life consumed by the Greater Bendigo Residential Strategy, which is currently going through the planning scheme amendment process. Tonight, he will share some of his experiences and learnings over the past 13 years in relation to the seemingly opposing forces of planning for growth and protecting the environment. Outside of work, Andrew is married with 2 boys. He is a passionate Hawthorn supporter, a keen camper, a scout leader, and enjoys bike riding without lycra, apparently. Over to Andrew.
Thank you. I'll just out of the way a bit. Thank you for that, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight. This is a subject that I am fairly passionate about. You know, there's lots of discussions go on in our office, but I do have to say, when I first started dealing with this issue, I had thick black hair. Stuart knows, so it has taken its toll on me.
Andrew, could you just put the mic up a little bit, please, if you can? At all, might need to pull it through. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, this is actually a quote that I keep by my desk by Mencken, who's he was a journalist and a writer in America in the early part of last century. And it's something which reminds me that there are no easy answers to the work that we do, but there are certainly lots of wrong answers. Just in terms of my role and the things that we're dealing with, Bendigo, as we probably could all appreciate, is a very complex place to be planning for growth. I can't think of anywhere, certainly in Australia, that's probably more complex. We need to be planning and managing growth, managing heritage and neighbourhood character values, planning for the movement of people, open space, managing environmental risks around fire, floods and salinity, making sure that areas are properly serviced with both physical and social infrastructure, and making sure that people can access their daily needs. We've also been experiencing strong and sustained population growth, and Jodie mentioned some of this. So by 2036, there'll be 156,000 people living in Greater Bendigo. From where we are now, that means an additional 18,000 dwellings. And that works out at around 900 dwellings a year. So that's probably one of the strongest growth rates of any municipality of our scale. One of the other issues that we have, and this is certainly not unique to Bendigo, is that more than 50% of our households are 1 or 2 person households, and that's going to increase as the population ages. We also have a mismatch between the type of housing that's being built, with the bulk of new housing being 3 and 4 bedroom houses, but the majority of households being 1 or 2 people. Now, there will be 1 or 2 person households who want larger, extra bedrooms for families, but currently, if you are after a 2 bedroom house, they're few and far between. Bendigo is also a city in a forest, and I think this is a term that has been sort of floating around for some time. I don't need to tell people here about the importance of the environment we live in. but it certainly has biodiversity, landscape and amenity values. And there are not too many places you can stand in this city and not get a sense of that environment. And the environment is also one of the key contributors to the livability of our city. So how can we grow and protect the environment around us? That is the $64,000 question. Now I have included a couple of images of Bendigo just to remind us sort of where we were in our early days. Not a lot there in terms of biodiversity, I suspect. And then on the other side have a fairly typical photo of what the landscape we live in is like now. We have our challenges. One of the challenges is, at its core, the planning scheme is about facilitating development and managing other impacts. So, for example, if you want to clear vegetation, the offset requirements are essentially how you manage those impacts. We have a lot of policies at state and local level around protecting the environment that are intended to protect certain values, but the reality is that the primary consideration is the zoning of the land. Generally, the first words you read to any zone is to encourage or to provide, and it's not to protect. A further example of the impact of zoning is if you look at the general residential zone, there are no decision guidelines around considering environmental impacts, other than some vague references to how it might relate to the character of an area. So it's more of a neighbourhood character. But essentially the general residential zone is silent when it comes to the natural environment. We do have two controls in the planning scheme to protect biodiversity. We have the environmental significance overlay and the vegetation protection overlay. These overlays require a statement of significance. So why is a particular area important? What are the objectives that are trying to be achieved? And what are the permit requirements? So you need a permit to remove vegetation, all those sorts of stuff. I won't get into it because it's fairly boring. The success of these tools has, however, been limited over time, as a lot of vegetation is lost through a range of factors. This includes when infrastructure goes in, when someone decides they want to build a shed in their backyard. There's a whole range of things. We have exemptions in the planning scheme as well for the removal of vegetation, which I'll show some examples of how that works shortly. Where vegetation protection has been successful in an urban environment, it is where that vegetation is in an open space reserve or on roads, so basically retaining it in a public ownership. But then this creates its own challenges in terms of how the resources required to manage that vegetation. The planning scheme does contain a fairly long list of exemptions from requiring a planning permit for the removal of vegetation. These include construction of a building, fire protection, for road safety, those sorts of things. And importantly, that where the exemptions apply, there's no requirement to offset the loss of that vegetation. It's not tracked, so we don't know how much vegetation is lost through the exemptions. The city has tried a range of tools over the years to protect vegetation in urban areas. These have included having native vegetation precinct plans. We've used covenants, Section 173 agreements, building envelopes. I think the old Shire of Strathwood say even trialled putting signs on trees at one point. But again, with limited success. So the next few slides I'm going to show you are probably, they might be a bit shocking, which is sort of the point. They do relate to an old subdivision approval, so it'll be showing you over time what has happened in a particular area in terms of the loss of vegetation. Now I will say it was done under the old scheme, so there was no requirements for offsets. It's not a high-profile site, so people don't see it. You know, it's not one of those sites that's right in your face that you drive past all the time, and it is a fairly severe example. So this is in Robin Hill Estate in Maiden Gully in 2005. 3 years later, another 2 years later, another 2 years, and more recently. So all of that vegetation has essentially gone without the need for planting permits, no requirements for offsets. Now this is probably a fairly severe example. I don't know if we've got too many other areas in the city which are this extreme, but it's an example of how the vegetation controls in the planning scheme do, or probably should say, don't work.
Able to flick back to the first one again, please?
Now what I will point out is the area up on the top left corner there. That's actually a public open space reserve. So that's land that's been retained in public ownership, and that's where the vegetation has been retained. The issue we have is that once development happens all the way around that reserve, it doesn't link to any other vegetation. It doesn't really form a part of a corridor for the movement of fauna. And I'll touch on that point a bit further.
Sorry, would that have been good, that smaller patch?
I used to live just around the corner, and it hadn't been burnt while I was there. It's actually owned by council, so it's not Crown land as such. But yeah, I'm not aware that it's ever been burnt. We do have more challenges, of course. One of the things that we've found over time is that protecting vegetation within the urban growth boundary is very difficult from a planning perspective. The argument is often put that where residential development occurs, any vegetation that has been set aside in reserves and those sorts of things will experience a decline in its biodiversity values over time. Whoops.
Rescue.
Sorry, I didn't do anything, did I?
No, let's just post
Love technology. Now there are conflicting views about whether or not these biodiversity values do decline over time, and I don't want to get into those arguments here because we could be here all night. As we push out, as the city continues to grow outward, we eventually will continue to hit up against the public land boundary. This places increased pressure on the need for controlled burning on the Crown land, and there are concerns held about the impacts that this will have on biodiversity. And trust me, do not ask Robin Major to discuss this issue with you, because she does get a bit worked up about it. We also have the bushfire regulations, which have changed significantly since the Royal Commission handed down its report. It is now state policy that the prioritisation and protection of human life takes priority over other policy considerations in the planning scheme, which I think is probably a reasonable approach to do, but again, it just makes the protection of vegetation that much harder. Our residential strategy that I'm going through the panel process for at the moment, we're proposing a sort of a 3-stage approach to dealing with the planning and bushfire issues. In the first instance, we'll be suggesting that development be encouraged into areas where there is low risk from bushfire. Where development occurs in areas of medium risk, then that needs to be managed, but we need to avoid development in areas of high bushfire risk. and the CFA have been very supportive of that approach. Now the plan on the graph on the slide there is really about indicating the importance of density for Bendigo. So with our planning for growth, if we continue to grow at sort of 12 dwellings a hectare, which has been sort of, I suppose, a fairly standard rate of development over time, then that large rectangle represents how much land we need to accommodate it at that density. But if we work down to 30 dwellings a hectare, then we only need 560 hectares of land. So increasing densities is one of the key things we need to be doing in terms of placing less pressure on areas where there are vegetation and biodiversity issues. I think one of the discussions this community is going to have at one point is to decide what are the key areas to protect. Is it land inside the urban growth boundary or land outside the urban growth boundary? And I think one of the really difficult discussions we're going to have is, should all the vegetation in the urban growth boundary be considered as lost? And we focus our energies on protecting what's outside the urban growth boundary. Again, it's fairly challenging sort of thought, but if we're going to be growing to 200,000 people, it's a conversation we're going to need to have at some point. There are opportunities, however, so it's hopefully not all doom and gloom. One of the key things I think is for the community to get involved in strategic planning processes. When we're doing residential strategies, when we're doing structure plans for areas, get involved in the conversations early and be strategic. If you are waiting for a planning permit application, it's being advertised next door to you, it's probably too late to be fighting for it. The deal is done. So one of my key learnings over the past 12 years is that if there are areas you want to protect, don't zone them for urban development. There are also other things that we can be doing. I have mentioned the issues around density, so we do need to be looking at how we grow. We do need to be encouraging more development within existing residential areas. People don't like it. There's a lot of NIMBYism going on. I think most people know what NIMBY stands for. Medium density housing is often viewed as being substandard housing. I don't think it is. It just needs to be done well. And if we want to be protecting the environment, we need to be seeing more of it happening. And my other advice to people is to work with the developers. 10 years ago, environmental groups and developers were probably on opposite sides of the fence, throwing stones at each other. But I think if you sat down and talked to them, and Damien is a good example, you'll probably find that your perspectives aren't that far apart. And we've certainly worked closely with the Urban Development Institute of Australia over the past probably 2 or 3 years in developing our strategy. And they've been a key player and have really, I think, contributed a lot to the outcomes of our strategy.
Round of applause.